Hello, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking into something pretty fundamental. Forces that are constantly at work, kind of behind the scenes, running the chemistry of our world, and, well, even inside us.
That's right. A lot of the critical chemistry, especially for life, happens in water, and it's controlled really precisely.
Often in ways we don't even think about.
Exactly. We're talking about acid-base equilibria. These are the principles keeping everything in balance, from a pond to literally your own blood. And the balance has to be incredibly narrow. Human blood, for instance, needs to stay right around pH 7.4.
Wow, that tight.
Oh, yeah. Life is really sensitive to these things. It absolutely hinges on maintaining these specific chemical conditions.
Okay, so let's really dig into this. Today, we're doing a deep dive using Chapter 15 of Zumdahl's Chemistry as our guide. Our mission is to unpack things like the common ion effect, buffered solutions, titrations, indicators, and even these things called polyprotic acids. And we want to make it clear for you without needing any diagrams.
Right. We won't just cover the what, but really get into the why they matter. Why your cells stay stable, how your body deals with exercise, how labs perform crucial analyses. Think of it as a shortcut to understanding chemistry's really essential balancing act.
All right, let's start with this common ion effect. It sounds kind of simple, but you're saying it's powerful. Imagine maybe a crowded room, people moving between two areas. What if you suddenly add more people to one area, but they're the same type of people who are already wanting to move?
Exactly. The system adjusts, right?
Yeah.
It has to. In chemistry, it means adding an ion that's, well, already part of an ongoing equilibrium. Take hydrofluoric acid, HF. It's a weak acid, so in water, it sort of partially breaks apart into H plus and F ions. There's a balance.
Okay, so it's an equilibrium.
Right. Now, what happens if you add something like sodium fluoride, NaF, that dissolves completely, releasing lots of extra F ions?
The common ion, because F was already there from the HF breaking apart.
Precisely. You've just dumped in more product. So Le Chatelier's principle kicks in the system, tries to relieve that stress. It pushes the equilibrium backwards, to the left.
Meaning less HF breaks apart.
Exactly. Less HF dissociates, so that the concentration of H plus ions goes down. The solution becomes less acidic than it would have been with just the HF alone. It's the same idea for weak bases, by the way. If you add, say, ammonium chloride to an ammonia solution, you add NH4 plus NO, the common ion, and it reduces the OH concentration.
So it's like a control knob for how much an acid or base dissociates.
That's a great way to put it, a subtle but powerful control. And understanding this is actually crucial for grasping our next topic, buffered solutions.
Right, buffers. These seem really important. You hear about them a lot. They're the solutions that kind of famously resist changes in pH, even if you add a bit of acid or base.
They are absolutely vital. And like you said earlier, you experience them constantly. Your blood is a prime example. It's buffered mainly by a mix of carbonic acid, H2CO3, and its conjugate base, the bicarbonate ion, HCO3.
Keeping it right at that 7.4 pH level.
Exactly. Our cells are incredibly sensitive. Even the lactic acid from a workout or just normal metabolic waste adds acid to your system. The buffer neutralizes it, keeps that pH incredibly stable. Without it, well, things would go wrong very quickly.
Okay, so how do they work? What's actually in a typical buffer?
Well, usually you have a weak acid and its conjugate base. A common example is acetic acid, the acid in vinegar, mixed with sodium acetate, which provides the acetate ion, its conjugate base. Or you could have a weak base, like ammonia, NH3, mixed with ammonium chloride, which provides the ammonium ion, NH4, plus its conjugate acid.
So you need both halves of the pair, the acid and its related base, or the base and its related acid.
You got it. That's the key.
Yeah.
Because they work together. If you add some strong base, like hydroxide ions, OH, the weak acid part of the buffer, let's call it HA, reacts with it. HA plus OH makes water, and the conjugate base, A. So the added OH gets used up.
Okay, so it neutralizes the added base. What about adding acid?
If you add acid, so H plus ions, the conjugate base part of the buffer, A, steps in. A plus H plus reforms the weak acid, HA. Again, the added H plus gets consumed.
So either way, the added strong acid or strong base gets converted into the weak form that's already part of the buffer.
Precisely. And because you start with relatively large amounts of both the weak acid, HA, and its conjugate base, A, compared to the small amount of H plus or OH you might add, the ratio of A to HA doesn't change very much.
Oh, and that ratio must be what determines the pH.
Exactly right. That's where the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation comes in handy. It's pH equals pKa plus the log of that ratio, AHA.
Yeah.
Since the ratio barely changes, the log of the ratio barely changes, and so the pH stays remarkably stable.
And pKs, that's just a measure of the weak acid's strength, right?
Right. Specifically, it's the pH where the acid is exactly half dissociated, meaning HA equals A. At that point, the ratio is 1, log 1 is 0, so pH equals pKa. But the main point is the stability.
You mentioned an example comparing it to water.
Oh, yes, dramatic. Add, say, zero point 0.01 moles of sodium hydroxide to a liter of a decent acetic acid acetate buffer. The pH might shift by only, like, 0.02 units. Tiny. Add that same 0.01 moles of NaOH to a liter of pure water, pH 7. The pH jumps all the way up to 12, a change of 5 full pH units.
Wow, that really shows the power. Huge difference.
It really does. That's the power of buffering in action.
So a buffer resists pH change, but surely there's a limit. It can't just keep absorbing acid or base forever, right? That sounds like buffering capacity.
Exactly. Buffering capacity. It's basically the amount of acid or base the buffer can soak up before the pH starts to change significantly. And what determines that capacity is simply the actual amounts, concentrations, of the weak acid and conjugate base components.
So more stuff means more capacity.
Pretty much. Think of it like a sponge. A bigger, thicker sponge can absorb more water than a tiny one. A buffer with higher concentrations of HA and A has a larger capacity because there are more molecules available to react with any incoming H+, or OH.
Okay, that makes sense. Higher concentration, higher capacity. Is there an ideal setup?
There is. Buffering works best, meaning it resists changes in both directions most effectively when the concentrations of the weak acid and its conjugate base are roughly equal.
So when that ratio AHA is close to 1,
Exactly. And remember Henderson Hasselbalch. When that ratio is 1, the pH of the buffer is equal to the pK of the weak acid. That's why if you need to make a buffer for a specific pH, say pH 5, you'd choose a weak acid whose pK is as close to 5 as possible, and then you'd aim to have roughly equal amounts of the acid and its conjugate base. That gives you the best capacity right around your target pH.
got it. Choose an acid with the right pK and use decent concentrations of both forms.
You've got it. That's the recipe for a good buffer.
All right, let's shift gears a bit, moving from keeping things stable to actually measuring changes. Let's talk about titrations. This is a really core technique in chemistry labs, right? For finding unknown concentrations.
Absolutely fundamental. A titration is essentially a controlled reaction. You carefully add a solution, the concentration of, that's the titrant, to a solution where you don't know the concentration until the reaction between them is just complete.
And you track how the pH changes as you add the titrant?
Yes, you monitor the pH throughout the addition, and plotting that pH versus the volume of titrant added gives you a pH curve or titration curve. It's incredibly informative. Oh, and a quick note on calculations, because we often use small volumes like milliliters. It's convenient to work in millimoles, which is just the thousandth of a mole. Molarity then just becomes millimoles per milliliter. Makes math a bit easier sometimes.
Okay, millimoles per milliliter. So what does a typical titration curve look like? Say, if you titrate a strong acid with a strong base.
Good starting point. Strong acid, strong base. The reaction is simple. H++ OH goes to water. Total neutralization. The curve starts at a very low pH because you begin with the strong acid.
Yeah.
As you add the strong base, the pH rises slowly at first, then right around the point where you've added exactly enough base to neutralize all the acid that's the equivalence point, the pH shoots up incredibly steeply. A huge jump.
And where does that equivalence point land for strong acid, strong base?
Always at pH 7.00, because
Right.
at that point, all you've essentially got is water and a neutral salt. Neither the cation from the strong base nor the anion from the strong acid reacts with water to affect the pH. So, perfectly neutral.
Okay, pH 7, steep jump. What about weak acids? I bet those are different.
They are, and much more interesting. Let's say you titrate a weak acid, HA, with a strong base, OH. The reaction is HA plus OH forms A, the conjugate base, plus water. The curve starts at a higher pH than a strong acid, because the weak acid isn't fully dissociated.
Right, makes sense.
And as you add the base, you see something crucial. A buffer region. Here, the pH changes much more gradually. Why? Because as you add OH, you're converting HA into A. You're creating a mixture of the weak acid and its conjugate base. You're literally making a buffer solution in the flask.
So the solution starts buffering itself during the titration. Clever.
It is. Then eventually you overcome the buffer, and the pH rises more steeply towards the equivalence point. But here's the key difference. The equivalence point for a weak acid-strong base titration is always above pH 7.
Above 7. Why is that?
Because at the equivalence point, all the HA has been converted to A, And A is the conjugate base of a weak acid, which means A itself is a weak base. It reacts slightly with water, A plus H2O gives HA plus OH, producing a small amount of hydroxide ions, making the solution slightly basic.
So the end product isn't neutral. Got it. These curves sound really informative.
They are. And there's another incredibly useful point on the weak acid curve. The point where you're exactly halfway to the equivalence point. Think about what's happened there. You've added exactly half the amount of base needed to react with all the initial acid.
So half the HA has become A.
Exactly. Which means at the halfway point, the concentration of the weak acid, HA, is equal to the concentration of the conjugate base, A.
Oh. And back to Henderson Hasselbalch, if HA equals A, the ratio is 1 log 1 is 0.
So pH equals pK. At the halfway point of a weak acid titration, the measured pH is numerically equal to the pK of that weak acid. And it's a fantastic way to experimentally determine the pK and therefore the acid strength of an unknown weak acid.
That's really powerful just from looking at the midpoint of that buffer region on the curve.
Precisely. And just quickly, the reverse is true too. If you titrate a weak base with a strong acid, the curve starts high, has a buffer region, and the equivalence point is always below pH 7 because you formed the conjugate acid, which is weakly acidic. These curves are like fingerprints.
Okay, so we can get all this information from the pH curve, but in the lab, how do you actually see when you've hit that equivalence point or close to it? You can't just watch a pH meter constantly sometimes. That's where indicators come in, the things that change color.
Exactly right. Acid-base indicators are the visual signal. They let you know when you've reached the end point of the titration, which you hope is very close to the actual equivalence point.
And how do they work? Are they just magic dyes?
Not quite magic, but clever chemistry. Indicators are usually weak acids themselves. Let's call a generic indicator H or N. Like any weak acid, it exists in equilibrium with its conjugate base N, HI, equals H plus N. The crucial thing is that the acid form, HI, has one color, and the conjugate base form, N, has a different color.
Like phenolphthalein, colorless and pink.
Perfect example. Phenolphthalein is colorless in its HI form, in acidic neutral solution, and bright pink in its N form, in basic solution. The color you see depends on the ratio of N to N. When the pH changes enough to shift that equilibrium significantly, the ratio changes, and your eye perceives the color change.
So when does that color change actually happen?
Well, our eyes aren't infinitely sensitive. We typically notice the color change when the ratio shifts from, say, 1 part ND to 10 parts Andy to about 10 parts ND to 1 part N. Because of the way logarithms work with the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation for the indicator itself, pH will be indicator plus log, NHI and N. This means the color change typically happens over a pH range of about 2 units, centered around the indicator's own pK value. So roughly from pK minus 1 to pK plus 1.
Okay, so each indicator has its own pK and its own pH range where it changes color.
Precisely. And the whole game is choosing an indicator whose color change range brackets the pH you expect at the equivalence point of your specific titration.
So you need to match the indicator to the titration.
Absolutely critical. For a strong acid-strong base titration, that big steep jump around pH 7 means lots of indicators will work fine. Methyl red, bronophenol blue, phenolphthalein, they all change color somewhere on that vertical part of the curve, so the endpoint will be very close to the equivalence point.
But for weak acids.
Trickier. Remember, the equivalence point is above pH 7, and the pH jump is less steep. You need an indicator whose pKa is close to the actual equivalence point pH. If you use methyl red, which changes around pH 5 for titrating acetic acid, the equivalence point may be around pH 8-9, you'll get the color change way too early. You'd likely want phenolphthalein for that one, as its color change pH 8-10 matches much better. Choosing the right indicator is key for accuracy.
It's all about making that visual signal match the chemical reality.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, one last area from the chapter, polyprotic acids. These are the ones that can give away more than one proton, like phosphoric acid, H3PO4.
That's the classic example. Yes, polyprotic acids donate their protons step by step. H3PO4 loses one proton to become H2PO4, then that can lose another to become HPO42, and finally that can lose the last one to become PO43. Each step has its own equilibrium and its own acid strength, its own Chi value.
So if you titrate something like phosphoric acid, you don't just get one reaction, but potentially 3.
Exactly. As you add base, you'll remove the first, most acidic proton completely. Then you'll start removing the second proton, and then the third. This means the titration curve won't have just one equivalence point jump. It can have multiple jumps, one for each proton removed.
Multiple steps on the curve.
Usually, yes, if the contrarities values are different enough. You'll see a first equivalence point after the first proton is gone, a second after the second proton, and maybe even a third if the acid is strong enough and you use a strong enough base.
And can we learn something from the points between those equivalence points, like the halfway points?
Absolutely. Just like with a monoprotic weak acid, the halfway point between the start and the first equivalence point corresponds to pH equal by A1 for the first proton. The halfway point between the first and second equivalence points gives you pH equals pKa2 for the second proton, and so on. Titrating a polyprotic acid is a fantastic way to experimentally determine all its individual pKa values.
So each proton kind of reveals its own acidity on the curve. How important is this concept?
Oh, incredibly important, especially in biology and biochemistry. Think about amino acids, the building blocks of proteins. They typically have at least two ionizable groups, an acidic carboxyl group, COH, and a basic amino group, NaCNH2. They are polyprotic. Their charge state, which depends heavily on the pH and their pKa values, is critical for how proteins fold and function. Enzymes, DNA, many vital biological molecules are polyprotic. Understanding how their protonation state changes with pH is fundamental to understanding life at the molecular level.
Wow, so it goes way beyond just titrating acids in a beaker.
Way beyond. It's central to how biological systems maintain structure and function.
Okay, that's been quite a journey through acid-base equilibria. We started with the common ion effect, sort of like a dimmer switch for dissociation.
Right, and saw how that leads to buffered solutions, those amazing pH stabilizers, doing critical work in everything from lab experiments to our own blood.
Then we mapped out reactions with titration curves, seeing how they reveal the strength and concentration of acids and bases, whether strong or weak.
Using those colorful indicators as our visual cues to find the endpoint. And finally, we saw how even complex polyprotic acids reveal their secrets step by step through titration.
And the key takeaway really seems to be that these aren't just abstract ideas. They're the real-world mechanisms controlling countless processes.
Absolutely. From environmental science, like how lakes buffer against acid rain, to developing new medicines that need to work at the body's pH, to ensuring quality in food production, these principles are everywhere.
It really highlights the delicate, constant chemical negotiations happening all around us and inside us.
It really does. The precision is quite amazing when you think about it.
So here's something to ponder as we wrap up. We've seen how powerful the common ion effect is in these acid-base systems. But thinking more broadly, how might unexpected shifts in common ions, maybe not just H plus or OH, but other ions introduced through pollution or industrial processes affect other kinds of chemical equilibria? Could subtle changes in, say, chloride or sulfate levels trigger unforeseen consequences in complex environmental or even biological systems by shifting equilibria we haven't even considered?
That's a really interesting thought. It highlights how interconnected these chemical systems are. A change in one component can ripple through in unexpected ways.
Definitely food for thought. It shows how understanding this fundamental balancing act is key to understanding and maybe protecting the world around us.